In a world drowning in constant noise, most people panic at the thought of being truly alone. Our phones buzz, feeds refresh, opinions bombard us, and silence feels unbearable. But what if solitude wasn't weakness? What if it was the sharpest weapon a human could wield? Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary samurai who carved his name into history with over 60 duels, didn't just survive chaos, he thrived in it. Not because he was the fastest or the strongest, but because he discovered something his enemies couldn't counter: the ruthless clarity of walking alone. Musashi wasn't just a swordsman, he was a strategist who treated combat like psychological warfare. Rumors say he deliberately showed up late to duels, making opponents stew in rage before cutting them down. He understood a timeless truth: the calmest man in the room controls the room. That's why his philosophy isn't limited to the battlefield. You can see it in hostage negotiators who keep a steady voice while lives hang in the balance, in CEOs who outlast rivals in boardroom standoffs. Even in the digital age where refusing to react to online outrage is itself an act of power. But Musashi's solitude wasn't about peace or tranquility. It was dark, dangerous, and brutally effective. He called it Dokkōdō, the path of walking alone. And in it he left behind 21 rules that reject comfort, attachments, and even ordinary happiness. His opponents thought they were fighting a man. They didn't realize they were facing a ghost who had already cut away every weakness inside himself. And here's the twist: the greatest lesson Musashi left us isn't how to fight, it's how to win without fighting at all. But to understand that, you have to step into his world of silence, shadows, and solitude. A world that still exposes our own weaknesses centuries later. Who was Musashi? Really, when most people hear the name Miyamoto Musashi, they imagine a wandering swordsman, a lone warrior from a distant era of Japan. But that image barely scratches the surface. Musashi wasn't a heroic knight in shining armor, nor a peaceful monk with a blade. He was something far more unsettling. A man who turned solitude into a weapon and lived by rules that made him both feared and respected. Born in 1584, in a Japan torn apart by endless civil wars, Musashi entered a world where survival was reserved for the cunning and the ruthless. He was a ronin, a masterless samurai, who answered to no lord, no clan, and no tradition but his own. That independence made him dangerous in ways his opponents never expected. Most samurai were bound by codes of loyalty and obedience. Musashi, he was bound only by his relentless pursuit of mastery, and that pursuit often meant blood. By his 20s, Musashi had already killed seasoned warriors in duels, sometimes in ways that broke every expectation of honor. Stories claim he showed up late to duels on purpose, letting his rivals fume in anger until their judgment clouded. Others say he used unorthodox weapons, like wooden swords, not just to humiliate, but to crush his opponent's spirit before the fight even began. To traditionalists, he looked reckless. To Musashi, it was strategy, psychological warfare disguised as chaos. But here's what makes Musashi more than a historical figure. His genius went beyond the blade. He painted, he wrote poetry, he mastered calligraphy, and he designed garden landscapes. In other words, he treated life itself as a battlefield of skills, each requiring the same discipline as swordsmanship. This blend of artistry and violence confused people then, and it still fascinates us today. Was Musashi a philosopher who used the sword to test his ideas? Or was he a killer who dabbled in philosophy to make sense of his isolation? That's the mystery history never resolved. What we do know is that Musashi's dueling record was terrifying. More than 60 victories, many to the death, and not once was he defeated. He wasn't the tallest, he wasn't the strongest, but he was always the calmest. And in the frenzy of combat, calm is lethal. Imagine standing across from a man who doesn't flinch, doesn't rush, doesn't show anger, while your own adrenaline shakes your hands. That silence, that stillness, was as sharp as his blade. And yet, Musashi's story wasn't one of endless violence. That's the part people often misunderstand. His duels were stepping stones, not trophies. Each one was a lesson, a way to strip away fear, ego, and weakness. To him, victory didn't mean standing over a dead opponent. It meant standing over the chaos within himself. This is why his legacy endures, because his philosophy wasn't about how to kill others. It was about how to conquer yourself. Here's where the controversy deepens. Musashi's writings don't read like the teachings of a peaceful sage. They read like the confessions of a man who understood that solitude and detachment can make you almost inhuman. He rejected luxury. He rejected attachments. He even rejected the comfort of belonging to a group. His path was radical. Walk alone, cut away distractions, and face the silence most people fear. Think about it in today's terms. Most people can't even sit in silence without reaching for their phone. Outrage on social media consumes millions every day. People trapped in endless arguments over nothing. Musashi would have laughed at that. To him, being dragged into someone else's emotions was the fastest way to lose. He lived like a hostage negotiator, a corporate strategist, and a lone wolf combined. Calm under pressure, detached from chaos, and impossible to manipulate. But here's the chilling truth. The more we study Musashi, the less certain we become about who he really was. Was he a philosopher of peace who disguised his wisdom in the language of combat? Or was he a brutal strategist who cloaked his ruthlessness in the veil of philosophy? Maybe the answer lies in the document he left behind just before his death, a set of rules so severe they still unsettle people today. And that's where Musashi's legend takes its darkest turn. On his deathbed, instead of clinging to life or seeking forgiveness, he wrote Dokkōdō, the path of walking alone. 21 principles that cut deeper than any sword he ever wielded. Principles that reject pleasure, comfort, and even love. They weren't meant to make life easier. They were meant to strip life down to its raw essence. The question is why? Why would a man who had everything, fame, mastery, immortality in history, leave behind a guide to solitude so ruthless it scares people centuries later? The answer lies in the way Musashi saw solitude not as peace, but as ultimate control. And that takes us to his final work, his last lesson, the path of walking alone. The path of walking alone, Dokkōdō. In 1645, after decades of duels, battles, and wandering, Miyamoto Musashi sensed his end was near. Most men facing death cling to family, comfort, or religion. Musashi did none of those things. Instead, he climbed into a cave, sat down in solitude, and wrote a document unlike anything Japan had ever seen. He called it Dokkōdō, the path of walking alone. 21 principles carved, not out of optimism or kindness, but out of a lifetime of blood, silence, and ruthless self-examination. It wasn't a book meant to inspire the masses. It wasn't even a manual for samurai. It was something colder, something more personal. Musashi's last blueprint for survival in a world designed to break men. If his more famous text, the Book of Five Rings, taught strategy for battle, Dokkōdō was the strategy for life itself, and it was far less forgiving. The very first precepts strike like a blade. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. In other words, don't chase dopamine. Don't drown yourself in entertainment. Don't cling to fleeting highs. Musashi was warning us. The more you depend on external validation, the easier it is for someone to control you. Think about that in today's world of infinite scrolling, likes and outrage cycles. People give away their energy to screens for nothing, while Musashi was saying, centuries earlier, that true freedom comes only when no pleasure owns you. Another principle: do not under any circumstances depend on a partial feeling. At first glance, it sounds cryptic, but Musashi was describing something brutally simple. Don't let emotions drive your decisions. Rage, lust, jealousy, they cloud judgment. He knew this better than anyone. Imagine standing on a dueling ground with swords drawn. The man who moves out of anger is the man who leaves himself open. The same applies today. The negotiator who reacts emotionally loses leverage. The executive who panics in a boardroom loses the deal. Musashi's advice was universal. Feel, but don't be ruled. Act, but don't be impulsive. The teachings only get harsher. Do not hold on to possessions you no longer need. For Musashi, this wasn't some minimalist lifestyle trend. It was life or death. A warrior burdened by attachments, whether to gold, weapons, or even relationships, would hesitate when the moment demanded decisiveness. To Musashi, hesitation was death. In our age of overconsumption, his words strike differently. We collect more than we need, hold grudges we should release, cling to relationships that suffocate us. Musashi's advice is clear: let go, or be dragged down. Then comes the most unsettling precept: do not fear death. This wasn't romantic. Musashi wasn't glorifying sacrifice. He was pointing to the one thing that paralyzes nearly everyone: fear. Fear makes men submit. Fear makes men hesitate. By rejecting fear itself, Musashi gained an edge in every duel. While others fought to preserve their lives, he fought already free of that burden. Imagine applying that today: the creator who risks without fearing failure, the activist who speaks when silence is safer, the person who stops living as though every mistake is fatal. Musashi's point was terrifying, but liberating. The moment you stop fearing the inevitable, you become untouchable. And then comes the principle that rattles even modern readers: be detached from desire your whole life long. At first it sounds like renunciation, like he wanted us to abandon ambition. But Musashi wasn't calling for passivity. He was warning against chains. Desires for wealth, fame, lust, approval can all be manipulated. They're levers others use to control you. A man ruled by desire is predictable. A man free from desire is dangerous, because no bribe, no temptation, no pressure can bend him. Taken together, the 21 rules of Dokkōdō form a philosophy that doesn't coddle. It strips, it cuts, it burns away illusions until only independence remains. That's why Musashi wrote it in solitude, at the end of his life. It wasn't a book for followers, it was a confession for anyone brave enough to step outside the noise and face themselves. But here's where the mystique deepens. Was Musashi passing down wisdom, or issuing a warning? Because hidden inside these rules is something darker. The realization that walking alone makes you powerful, but it also makes you untouchable in ways that can isolate you completely. He wasn't offering comfort. He was showing us what happens when you cut yourself free from every chain. You gain freedom, but you lose the world. And yet for Musashi, that trade was worth it. To him, solitude wasn't emptiness. It was the sharpest edge of all. But if solitude was a weapon, how exactly did Musashi wield it in his own life? The answer isn't peaceful meditation or monk-like retreat. It's something far more unsettling: the transformation of solitude into raw power. Solitude as a weapon. Most people think of solitude as quiet retreats, meditating in nature, or sipping tea in silence. For Miyamoto Musashi, solitude was never gentle. It was war. It was the tool he used to strip away fear, to control emotions, and to dismantle opponents before blades even crossed. His solitude wasn't about escaping the world. It was about mastering it. When Musashi stepped onto a dueling ground, his enemies often expected an honorable contest. What they got instead was something closer to psychological torture. He showed up late to duels, not by accident but by design, forcing his opponents to stew in rage, their heartbeat pounding faster with every wasted minute. By the time Musashi arrived, calm and detached, his opponent's nerves were already shredded. Solitude had trained him to be patient, unshaken, while others drowned in their own agitation. He even fought with wooden swords in battles to the death, a tactic that humiliated opponents and shattered their confidence. Imagine facing a man willing to meet your steel blade with wood. That act alone spoke louder than words. I don't need equal weapons. I don't need fairness. I need only my calm. That confidence was born from hours, days, years of isolating himself from the noise of society, cultivating an inner fortress no opponent could breach. But Musashi's solitude wasn't limited to duels. It shaped his entire philosophy of self-reliance. In Dokkōdō, he wrote, "Do not, under any circumstances, depend on a partial feeling." To most people, emotions are unavoidable guides, but to Musashi, they were traps. Anger makes you reckless. Desire makes you predictable. Fear makes you weak. Solitude allowed him to observe emotions like passing clouds, never clinging, never letting them rule. That discipline turned him into something close to machine-like precision on the battlefield, cold, efficient, impossible to rattle. This detachment extended beyond emotions to possessions, people, even his own reputation. "Do not hold on to possessions you no longer need," he instructed. For Musashi, letting go wasn't about minimalism or decluttering your desk. It was about refusing to let the world anchor you. If you can walk away from everything, nothing can chain you. That's not just philosophy. That's psychological warfare. Opponents can threaten to take what you own, ruin your name, even end your life. But if you don't cling to any of it, they have no weapon against you. That is the terrifying strength of solitude. And this isn't some relic of feudal Japan. You can see the same principle playing out today. Hostage negotiators who remain calm as lives hang in the balance. Boardroom leaders who refuse to be baited into emotional outbursts while rivals flail in desperation. Even in the digital battlefield of social media, the person who refuses to react to outrage often holds the most power. In each case, the calmest figure isn't passive. They're controlling the entire dynamic. That's Musashi's solitude in action. But solitude also sharpened Musashi's understanding of time. In silence, waiting became a weapon. Where others rushed, he delayed. Where others panicked, he watched. Solitude made him unpredictable. He could vanish into isolation for months, then reappear with new skills, new strategies, new levels of calm that unsettled everyone around him. Solitude was his laboratory, his training ground, his forge. Every hour alone was a blade being sharpened. And yet, there's a darker side here. Because the more you detach, the less human you appear. Some historians argue Musashi wasn't admired by his contemporaries. He was feared. His solitude made him an enigma, someone people couldn't fully understand or control. He wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting the very idea of dependence. And that kind of independence can look like invincibility or like madness. This is the paradox at the heart of Musashi's life. Solitude gave him mastery, but it also pushed him further and further away from ordinary human connection. To the world he was a legend, but to himself he was just a man, walking a lonely path no one else dared follow. So the question lingers, was Musashi's solitude a blessing or a curse? Did it make him wise, or did it hollow him out? The answer hides in the shadow of his legacy, in the unsettling realization that solitude doesn't only make you strong, it can also make you ruthless. And that leads us to the dark side of Musashi's philosophy, a truth that history often avoids because it's too uncomfortable. Solitude can forge greatness, but it can also destroy the very things that make life worth living. The dark side of solitude. It's tempting to romanticize solitude, to imagine that Musashi's path was one of serene wisdom, like a monk meditating under a waterfall. But solitude isn't always gentle. Sometimes it's jagged, brutal, and isolating. And Musashi's life reveals that the same solitude that forged his strength also carved out a loneliness few could endure. Musashi spent most of his life wandering, a ronin without a master, a swordsman without a home. He rejected comfort, avoided attachments, and lived as though the world itself was a temporary inn. Admirable, maybe, But look closer. While his peers built families, alliances, and legacies of tradition, Musashi moved alone, drifting from duel to duel, cave to cave. His philosophy gave him power, but it also left him untethered. At the end of his life, he retreated not into the arms of loved ones, but into a cave called Rigendu. Alone, sick, and facing death, he scribbled down his final 21 rules. That image isn't romantic, it's haunting. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Solitude can sharpen the mind, but it can also harden the heart. Musashi's writings strip away joy, warmth, and softness in the pursuit of strength. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Be detached from desire your whole life long. These aren't teachings of balance, they're teachings of denial. To live by them is to choose steel over silk, detachment over intimacy. Was Musashi wise for rejecting those human desires, or was he running from them? Some historians suggest his obsession with walking alone was less about strength and more about fear. Fear of being vulnerable, fear of needing anyone. By rejecting relationships, possessions, and attachments, he made sure nothing could ever be taken from him. That's a brilliant defense mechanism. But it also raises a darker question. Was Musashi's solitude the mark of a man who conquered his emotions, or the sign of someone who was too afraid to feel them fully? This duality isn't unique to Musashi. Look at modern life. We celebrate the lone genius, the self-made billionaire, the solitary artist locked in their studio. But behind those images, how many are quietly battling emptiness? How many sacrifice connection for mastery, only to discover too late that mastery without meaning is hollow? Musashi's solitude gave him invincibility in duels, but it also left him with no one to share his victories with. Strength, when carried alone, can turn into a prison. And yet that prison is what made him legendary. This is the paradox of the dark side of solitude. It takes as much as it gives. Solitude will strip you down, cleanse you of weakness, make you untouchable. But it may also strip away tenderness, connection, even joy. That's why Musashi's story unsettles us. He wasn't just the embodiment of discipline, he was also the embodiment of sacrifice. Was his philosophy about wisdom, or was it about becoming emotionally numb? When he told us to think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world, was he teaching humility, or confessing his own emptiness? No one can say for sure, but one thing is undeniable. Musashi's solitude made him powerful, and it also made him unknowable. His peers respected him, feared him, even mythologized him. But did anyone truly know him? Probably not. That's the hidden cost of walking alone. No one walks beside you. And this is where Musashi's path collides with our own modern fears. In an age of constant connection, solitude feels like starvation. People would rather drown in notifications than sit alone in silence. Yet Musashi's life reminds us that solitude is both salvation and curse. Too little, and you're lost in the crowd. Too much, and you're lost to yourself. That tension is exactly what makes his philosophy so dangerous and so fascinating. Because Musashi wasn't simply teaching us to embrace solitude, he was daring us to accept its cost. Power, freedom, independence. Yes, but love, comfort, belonging. Those may never return once you choose the path of walking alone. And yet, if solitude carries such danger, why would Musashi cling to it until his dying breath? Why did he see it as the ultimate training ground, the ultimate shield, and the ultimate truth? To answer that, we have to step into the modern world, because Musashi's lessons didn't die with him. They only became sharper in an age where distraction is our greatest enemy. Solitude in the modern world. When Musashi spoke of solitude, his world was war-torn Japan, a place where survival meant sharpened steel and sharpened minds. Our world couldn't look more different. No dueling grounds, no wandering ronin, no feudal lords demanding loyalty. And yet, His lessons strike harder today than ever before, because our battlefield isn't fought with swords, it's fought with distractions. Think about it. In Musashi's day, solitude meant withdrawing from clans, politics, or the noise of a village. In ours, solitude means pulling yourself away from a glowing screen that's designed to never let you go. Social media platforms wage war for our attention, the way rival warlords once battled for territory. Outrage trends in real time. Opinions slam into you the moment you open your phone. People live half their lives reacting to headlines, strangers, and endless notifications. Solitude in this world isn't natural. It's an act of rebellion. That's why Musashi's first precept, "Do not seek pleasure for its own sake," feels almost prophetic. He couldn't have imagined TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, or the endless scroll of dopamine hits. Yet he was describing the exact trap billions fall into today. Every like, every comment, every notification is a fleeting pleasure, a temporary high, that chains you to the machine. Musashi's point was brutally simple. The more you crave, the more you're controlled. If you can step back, resist the pull, and find contentment within yourself, you're no longer a slave to the noise. Consider his principle. Do not, under any circumstances, depend on a partial feeling. In a duel, this meant don't swing out of anger or flinch from fear. In our world, it means don't let temporary emotions dictate permanent choices. How many people post something in rage, only to regret it hours later? How many ruin relationships because they couldn't resist firing off a heated text? Musashi's solitude trained him to pause, to detach, to let emotions pass before acting. Imagine if people practiced that online. Wars would end before they started. Friendships would survive petty storms. Leaders would avoid disasters. His advice, centuries old, reads like a manual for surviving Twitter. But Musashi's solitude wasn't only about silence. It was about clarity. He advised letting go of possessions, of relationships, of attachments that no longer served you. In today's terms, that means more than just cleaning out your closet. It means learning to let go of toxic friendships, unhealthy habits, and digital addictions that drain your strength. Musashi wasn't being poetic. He was being practical. A warrior who clings to the unnecessary becomes slow. A person who clings to every distraction becomes powerless. Solitude is the art of cutting away until only the essential remains. And then comes his most haunting precept: do not fear death. In the 1600s, that meant standing fearless on a dueling ground. Today, it means something different. Most people don't fear death as much as they fear irrelevance. They fear missing out, being forgotten, being excluded from the digital hive. That fear drives them to stay constantly plugged in, constantly performing. Musashi's solitude calls that bluff. By embracing silence, by willingly stepping out of the current, you discover a shocking truth. The world goes on without you, and that's liberating. So how do we apply Musashi's solitude in a hyper-connected age? It starts with small rebellions. A digital detox, even for an hour, is the modern equivalent of Musashi retreating to a cave. Turning off notifications is your duel against distraction. Taking a walk without headphones, sitting in silence without reaching for your phone. These are tiny victories, but they echo his philosophy. They teach you to face the unease of aloneness, to step into the silence most people run from. But solitude today isn't just physical, it's mental. Musashi spoke of not depending on others for validation. In a world where everyone curates their lives for approval, that lesson cuts deeper than any sword. Imagine being untouchable to criticism, immune to praise, free from the need to compare. That's not isolation, that's independence, and it's a skill almost no one practices. This is why Musashi's philosophy still matters. His solitude wasn't escapism, it was resistance. In his time, it made him unbeatable. In ours, it makes us free. To walk alone in an age where everyone fears silence is to claim power most people will never know. But here's the catch: solitude, even today, is never easy. It feels unnatural, uncomfortable, even dangerous. And Musashi understood this better than anyone. He didn't promise comfort, he promised growth. Which brings us to the hardest truth of all. The line between solitude and loneliness is razor thin, and crossing it can change everything. Loneliness versus solitude. Most people today confuse two very different experiences. Loneliness and solitude. On the surface, they look the same. Both involve being alone, separated from others. But the difference is everything. Loneliness is emptiness. Solitude is power. Musashi understood this distinction centuries before psychologists ever studied it, and it was central to his philosophy. Loneliness is the feeling of being unwanted, unseen, or cut off. It's the ache you feel when you crave connection and don't receive it. Solitude, by contrast, is a choice, a deliberate withdrawal, a state where you engage with yourself rather than run from yourself. Loneliness weakens you. Solitude sharpens you. This is why Musashi didn't simply tolerate being alone. He embraced it as a training ground. Think of how he lived. He didn't walk into crowded halls or beg for recognition. He retreated to caves, wrote in silence, and turned inward. For Musashi, solitude wasn't punishment. It was where he discovered clarity, the stillness that made him calm in chaos. That calmness was what terrified his opponents. While they raged with fear or anger, Musashi stood unmoved, because he had already faced himself in solitude. He had battled the storm inside, long before stepping onto the dueling ground. This is where modern society gets it wrong. People fear silence, because in silence, they're forced to meet themselves. That's why phones glow in every pocket, music fills every room, and social feeds keep scrolling at 2 a.m. Loneliness creeps in when people realize that even surrounded by noise, they feel empty. Musashi flipped that on its head. He proved that if you embrace the silence willingly, you don't feel emptiness, you feel strength. The chatter of the world no longer defines you, you define yourself. His precepts make the divide crystal clear. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. A lonely man obsesses over himself, over his shortcomings, over the approval he doesn't receive. A solitary man, in Musashi's sense, looks outward, not for validation, but for understanding. He humbles his ego, frees himself from comparisons, and expands his vision. That shift transforms aloneness from suffering into wisdom. And Musashi didn't pretend this path was easy. He admitted that solitude can feel uncomfortable, even painful. That discomfort is why most avoid it. But he also believed discomfort was proof you were growing. Musashi treated solitude like a forge. Just as fire burns away impurities in steel, silence burns away illusions in the mind. Loneliness corrodes, solitude purifies. Consider the parallels today. Loneliness drives people into endless digital performances, trying to be noticed, liked, followed. Solitude, on the other hand, is when you delete the performance and simply exist with yourself. Loneliness is dependence on others for worth. Solitude is independence from that dependence. And in a world addicted to attention, independence is almost revolutionary. Musashi's own life embodied this paradox. He was admired and feared, yet he chose not to be surrounded by admirers. He could have lived under the patronage of lords, bathed in riches, enjoyed fame. Instead, he wandered, often in poverty, because he valued solitude more than status. Was that sacrifice? Yes. Was it freedom? Absolutely. To him, the risk of loneliness was worth the reward of self-mastery. Here lies the razor's edge. Too little solitude, and you drown in the crowd. Too much, and you risk cutting yourself off from everything human. Musashi walked that edge fearlessly, maybe even recklessly. His solitude gave him unmatched clarity and control, but it also left him deeply alone in his final days. That is the paradox we must face if we attempt to walk his path. But this paradox is also the lesson. Loneliness happens when you resist aloneness. Solitude begins when you embrace it. Musashi's life forces us to ask, are we afraid of being alone because we fear emptiness, or because we fear the truths silence will reveal? And here's where the story sharpens to its point. Musashi wasn't teaching us to wall ourselves off from humanity. He was teaching us to master the one battle most people never fight, the battle with ourselves. Because once you master solitude, once you can stand alone without fear, then no enemy, no crowd, no rejection can ever truly defeat you. But if that's true, then what was Musashi's ultimate goal? If solitude gave him invincibility, what did he intend to do with that power? The answer is not what most expect. The ultimate secret. By now it's tempting to see Musashi as a man defined by violence, a duelist who carved his legend through 60 battles, a swordsman whose solitude turned him into an unstoppable force. But if you look closer beneath the blood and discipline, his greatest secret comes into focus. The real power of Musashi's solitude wasn't in fighting at all. It was in choosing not to fight. Think about it. Musashi won duel after duel, not simply because he swung a sword better than anyone else, but because he created conditions where his opponents were already defeated before blades clashed. He delayed duels, broke conventions, used wooden weapons, and manipulated emotions. In doing so, he revealed the essence of his strategy. Victory didn't require endless violence. It required mastery over yourself, and through that mastery, mastery over others. His solitude was the forge where that mastery was built. This is why Dokkōdō feels so uncompromising. Each principle strips away something that can be used against you: desire, possessions, fear, ego. What remains is a self so untouchable that no one can control it. A man like that doesn't need to fight every battle, because the world has no leverage over him. That's the paradox of Musashi's life. He became legendary for his duels, but his philosophy shows us that the ultimate duel is the one you never need to enter. Look at the world around us. People exhaust themselves in constant battles, online arguments, petty rivalries, endless competition for status or attention. Every insult feels like a fight, every disagreement like a war. But Musashi's life whispers a darker, wiser truth. The strongest person isn't the one who reacts to every provocation. It's the one who remains silent, calm, unshaken, until the other side collapses under the weight of their own noise. That's why his solitude wasn't just isolation. It was a shield, a training ground, a throne. By walking alone, he cut away everything that made people desperate, reactive, and fragile. And when the moment came, he could step into battle from a place of total control, or refuse the battle entirely. In both cases, he won. There's a reason modern negotiators, leaders, and strategists still echo Musashi without even realizing it. The calmest voice in a crisis often carries the most weight. The leader who doesn't scramble to prove himself earns respect. The individual who can endure silence unnerves everyone else. Musashi was practicing these truths centuries before psychology had a name for them. And yet, his philosophy forces us to wrestle with something uncomfortable. Musashi's path worked for him, but it was harsh, lonely, even tragic. To walk it fully may mean sacrificing warmth, comfort, and intimacy. The reward is freedom. The cost is connection. That's the choice his life leaves hanging in front of us. So what do we take from Musashi today? Not that we should all abandon society, live in caves, and reject every pleasure, but that in the noise of the modern world, we must reclaim the strength to be alone, to detach from the endless demands for our attention, to sit in silence without fear, to master the one opponent who defeats most people themselves. Because here's the twist Musashi left us with: the sharpest blade is not the one that cuts down others, but the one that cuts away our own weaknesses. The greatest duel is not against enemies, but against our own dependence, fear, and craving. And the ultimate victory is not standing over a fallen rival, but walking away entirely, untouchable. because you no longer need the fight. That's why Musashi still haunts us centuries later. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a reminder of a truth most people can't bear. If you can walk alone, you cannot be defeated.